Two different winners and a surprising number of talking points meant the Belgian Grand Prix was a lot more interesting than the races made it look, so here's everything we learned from Spa. Yuki Tsunoda had a change of Red Bull car specification mid-weekend at Spa that sparked a big qualifying breakthrough, even though the end result was still the same. Tsunoda's pointless run has now been extended to 6 Grand Prix and a sprint race, but at Spa he qualified 7th on the grid for the main event and was only 0.38 seconds slower than Max Verstappen, the closest the second Red Bull has been to Max at Spa since Daniel Ricciardo in 2018. It was facilitated by Red Bull finally bringing Tsunoda onto the same floor specification as Verstappen in the middle of the weekend. Although Tsunoda was still missing a little, like a new front wing, the extra floor performance immediately brought his best qualifying result for Red Bull yet, and that is no coincidence. Unfortunately, Red Bull botched his pit stop timing in the race, calling him in too late, so he had to do another lap on intermediates. This dropped him out of the points, and he could do nothing once stuck behind Pierre Gasly's extremely low downforce Alpine in 10th, as drag levels were absolutely critical to cars being able to pass this weekend. There are still some issues for Tsunoda to work out, notably weaker race pace and some lingering tyre management uncertainties. And even if beating Gasly wasn't possible, getting picked off late on by Ollie Behrman and Nico Hülkenberg was probably avoidable. For the first time in this title battle, Oscar Piastri's used the boldness and bravery we saw a couple of times in 2024, when he ruthlessly passed teammate Lando Norris on the first lap at Monza and dived past Charles Leclerc for the win in Baku. So far in 2025, Piastri's championship bid has been built on a strong qualifying record, good consistency, good racecraft against others, and his cool demeanour. In Belgium though, something else came to the fore. Piastri took the one chance he had to jump on small Norris misjudgments at the start, capped off with a brave run up Eau Rouge and through Raidillon, as while Norris needed a confidence lift, Piastri stayed on full throttle. This gave him such momentum, he was able to jink left and pass Norris so emphatically early on the straight. Everything that followed was textbook Piastri in 2025, but it was the first time he's had to show he can and will lean on his killer instinct in direct competition with Norris in this title fight. From being the team that had looked to be on par with Red Bull at the start of the season as McLaren's main challenger, Mercedes has fallen away badly. A year on from finishing 1-2 on the road at Spa, Mercedes watched George Russell have a lonely run to 5th, while Kimi Antonelli endured the toughest weekend of his F1 career so far. Suspicions point not to the team having simply fallen away in the development war, but instead of it having taken a wrong path with recent upgrades that have done something to the W16's handling characteristics. This has resulted in a car that's proving much more tricky to drive, especially with corner entry instability at the rear, and that is triggering more mistakes from its drivers. Russell himself reckons this may all be a consequence of the flexi-wing clampdown that came into force for the Spanish Grand Prix in June. He said Mercedes had gone in a slightly different direction to tackle that issue, and that clearly since that point we've taken a big step backwards. The team has scheduled meetings at its Brackley base this week to try to get an understanding on what's gone wrong and what areas of the car it may need to roll back on in a bid to give both its drivers something less difficult underneath them. Painful as this is to say, Spa's compatibility with modern F1 has never seemed worse. Qualifying at Spa is brilliant, and in the wet it's still a mighty challenge, but the two races F1 had this weekend were deeply underwhelming. With very little in the way of overtaking, Saturday's sprint race was the weakest since a very static maiden sprint at the 2021 British Grand Prix. Then Sunday showed the extent of the visibility problem here that is the enemy of good wet racing, especially with current F1 cars producing so much spray. Even Lewis Hamilton, who was calling for the race to start earlier than it did, admitted Spa makes it feel like driving through fog. Spa's already shifting to a rotated spot on the calendar, but as one team boss told us, if it keeps suffering from races being delayed or flirting with not happening at all because of the weather, even in earlier in the summer, it could lose its place permanently. And even when conditions are dry, F1 at Spa is a shadow of the past. The races feature little overtaking and just DRS trains. So we and F1 can only hope that the 2026 cars will be better suited to such a legendary track. Ferrari's much anticipated new rear suspension, designed to help the car run lower and access its full potential, made its debut at Spa, where Charles Leclerc used it to good effect to outqualify Verstappen's Red Bull and beat it to the podium. In combination with the major floor upgrade recently introduced, it is hoped the new suspension will realise the SF25's so far disguised potential. Leclerc said it definitely helped him beat Verstappen, who was defeated by a combination of Leclerc doing a better job in qualifying to get track position, then Leclerc hanging on in the damp first stint before the dry track suited his low drag Ferrari setup better. But Leclerc's 20-second deficit to the winning McLaren showed Ferrari's car will not suddenly become a regular race winner. And he was almost at pains to downplay the upgrade this weekend because while it's delivered what Ferrari expected, Leclerc admitted it's still not enough. Every team but one has now scored points in a sprint race in 2025, and Spa illustrated how valuable this format could be for the midfielders. Although the sprints are dominated by the big teams and therefore the most valuable positions are usually locked in, there have actually been quite a few opportunities for the best performing midfield teams to grab good results. At Spa, the big teams were particularly wasteful. Mercedes was out of the picture on Saturday, and Ferrari and Red Bull were both missing a car each. That's what allowed Haas, Williams and Racing Bulls to all finish in the top 8. Haas and Williams scored their first Saturday points of the season in Belgium, with Haas enjoying a bumper haul of 6 points. That's 17% of its entire 2025 tally, easily the biggest share of any team. But next in that comparison is Aston Martin on 11% and Racing Bulls on 9.8%. This obviously reflects the lower total yield for the midfield teams, but it wouldn't be possible if they weren't able to score points in the sprint to begin with. And that's happening because the field is so condensed, so an underachieving big team opens the door for an overachieving smaller team, but crucially, there's less time in the sprint for the status quo to be restored. Sprint points don't actually change the midfield championship fight yet, but there's a trend developing, which means the remaining 3 sprints in Austin, Brazil and Qatar could be a bigger factor than most think. Red Bull's new team boss had a winning debut in the Spa sprint, although the Grand Prix itself was a less successful affair. Still, Laurent Mekkier's first weekend in charge passed without any flare-up, flashpoint, war of words, drama or anything of the sort. It was a lot calmer than some of the Christian Horner days, but perhaps that's exactly what Red Bull and especially Mekkier's needed. There were some whispers during the Spa weekend that Horner loyalists hadn't taken well to his ousting and that the new way of working with centralised control from the Austrian parent company had gone down badly. It might not mean anyone has a problem with Mekkier's per se, but the reality is that it can be hard to get everyone on side immediately. Good results and performances and leading by example will start to set that right, and Mekkier's has said and done all the right things so far. He's been very calm, which has helped shift the narrative that Red Bull was in disarray. The team worked effectively for most of the weekend at Spa and turned around a mid-weekend upgrade for Tsunoda. Mekkier's also had a first test of how he might handle a team grievance. He expressed his surprise politely but firmly that the race wasn't started sooner, a decision that went against Red Bull and its setup choices. It was a hint that while he will probably not come bearing data traces and camera printouts like his predecessor when Red Bull feels wronged, Mekkier's won't shrink from saying what he thinks. Haas team boss Ayo Komatsu spent the first 2 days at Spa repeating his belief that his team needs to make better strategic choices in the wet. That's especially the case now it has a very quick midfield car following an upgrade at Silverstone where it was guilty of gambling too much, chasing a big result in mixed conditions. After a double points haul in the Spa sprint underlined its car's potential, Haas showed its pragmatism by splitting the 2 cars' downforce levels for the Grand Prix to cover which way the conditions went. Ollie Behrman's likely run into the points was then derailed by an engine glitch that dropped him out of the top 10, but Esteban Ocon wasn't in the picture because of another strategy error. He bemoaned a too late pit call, which left him adrift at the back of the pack and he failed to get back near the points afterwards. That left Ocon lamenting exactly what Komatsu had hoped to address, that when it's wet, we don't put things together. Kimi Antonelli's tough run got even worse at Spa, where the 18-year-old was slowest of all in sprint qualifying, 17th in the sprint race itself, and then suffered another Q1 exit in main qualifying. Antonelli was distraught after that, feeling he's taken a backward step since the start of the European season without the confidence to push the car to the limit. He started Sunday's race from the pit lane with more downforce, but his progress stalled when the track dried out, leaving him 16th, and without a point in 6 of the last 7 weekends. Antonelli has a more aggressive driving style than Russell, which he believes is only increasing the limitations of the Mercedes, and his attempts to drive differently end up feeling too forced. Over the coming races, Mercedes has a big task in helping Antonelli find his confidence, which seems worryingly low. Having been F1's worst scoring team in the midfield in the previous 5 races, Williams has just earned its biggest points total in over 2 months. Carlos Sainz was 6th in the sprint race, while teammate Alex Albon matched that result in the Grand Prix, 12 seconds clear of the next midfield runner, fending off Lewis Hamilton's Ferrari and finishing only 5 seconds behind Russell's Mercedes. Sainz had a weaker main qualifying, which led to a pit lane start to gamble on more downforce for a wet race that barely materialised and meant he was never in points contention in the Grand Prix. Still, a good haul across both days boosted Williams' advantage over the next best placed team Sauber to a healthier 27 points in the championship. And the suite of upgrades it brought to Spa across the sidepod and floor appeared to work as expected, even if they've made the car a little trickier to drive. Albon said it definitely helped them finish P6 at Spa, but thinks it's too early to declare Williams will be permanently back at the head of F1's midfield. Still, it did get back to giant killing again and has emphatically stopped the rot.